Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ron Daniels, Valerie Strauss, John White, and moderator Johann Neem.
Rusk? Slightly. I guess I'm on, so we'll get started. Welcome back after lunch. We're going to try to up the energy. I feel like we've been building to this panel with the last 2 days because I don't think there was a single session that did not mention schools and education. And I think that's really interesting, actually, to think about why that's the case. After the revolution, state constitutions, Georgia's, Massachusetts, others mentioned the importance of an educated public. George Washington famously advocated a national university. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had one of his most proud moments was the founding of a university. So education was central to the founding and to the founders. But it's interesting to know that as we've been talking about America's great experiment, past and present, and hinting at the future, that even today, education is the word that keeps coming up. And in many ways, I think it reflects our sense that this great experiment is also a fragile experiment. And so I guess I want to start with the question of the day, given the title of the panel, the role of education in democracy, which is, why do you think, whether the founders or today, we put so much energy in thinking about education, and particularly education in a democracy or a republic, if you want to use that term? And I guess maybe we'll start with John and come down this way. Would that work?
Terrific. Well, thanks for facilitating, Johann, and thank you for having me here. I don't think I have anything, probably it hasn't already been said, as you said, over the last couple of days in response to that general question. I would say that obviously there is an imperative for the populace to both have the dispositions and the skills to participate in a kind of collective exercise of democracy and the participation in the institution of our republics, as well as to have a sense of the individual identity and passions and energy that will make them somebody who takes those institutions forward and who's able to prosper from those institutions. I think that probably we will hear a kind of similar thread to those lines as we go through the conversation. What I think is probably most challenging is, how do you do that? And I would say that on both counts, both in terms of building a foundation amongst the collective and creating the dispositions, the passions, the interests, and the habits among individuals to advance in society, we are failing quite badly.
Again, thank you for being here and doing this and for having me. As you yourself have written, the pre-Americans wanted literacy among the early pre-Americans so that they could read their Bible. And then as more and more people wanted to be educated, they started opening schools so that more people could learn basics reading, basic math. And then you have the Common School movement, where school was seen differently. School was seen as a way to create the American, where the idea was people from different places, different mindsets would come together, boys, true, white at the time, would come together and learn the dispositions of being an American. And so over time, that is what the public education system has sort of grown into, is this idea. It has failed to aspirationally do what it had wanted to do in some areas, and it's been very successful in other areas. But a democracy depends on educated people who can participate in it and who can understand what they have to do and why, and who can have critical thinking dispositions so that they can figure out fact from fiction. And so that's why education is so important in democracy.
So I don't think I can add a lot more to what John and Valerie said, but at least from my perch as the president of a university, you're constantly confronting this issue of what is the purchase of a university education at this moment in time, and in particular at a time when we know in this country, as has been well covered through this conference and other conversations we've been having over the last decade plus, but to the extent that we know we're deeply divided in this country, riven by polarization, distrust, and so forth, the question is, how do we, as universities, particularly a research university, properly discharge our educative responsibilities? And I think to some extent, and I hope we have a chance to talk about this a bit this afternoon, it's well understood, as Washington understood, that expertise, knowledge, scientific, social sciences, humanities, and so forth, is essential for progress more generally. It's essential for economic development, and particularly in a human capital economy that we live in today. But there's this other dimension that you've both referred to in terms of the intrinsic value of education in respect of the way in which it, at its best, cultivates the habits, the aptitudes of citizenship, and the sense of being able to navigate these very treacherous shoals that we're in today in a way that shows proper fidelity, understanding of the fragility of our democratic experiment, and how you as a citizen can contribute to that enterprise. So I think that although we talk a lot, and I think there's almost been a narrowing down of what university education is understood to be in America today, it clearly has value in terms of enhanced earning power and a host of other benefits. But this other dimension, the public good dimension of what it means to be a citizen, I think is a really important role and responsibility of the university.
Well, how do we convince people to think about those public dimensions? I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 20 or even more years in different ways is that education is about workforce preparation. We heard it from governors and presidents of both parties. We heard it at the K-12 level. We've heard it at the university level. Last night, we had a session on the relationship between the economy and democracy, and we were told, we need more STEM majors, but then we've also been hearing the need for people who are, as you say, prepared to participate in democracy, have certain dispositions and habits, have a kind of broader sensibility about the world, can tell truth from fiction. How do we articulate or convince people, especially at a time where there is clearly the need for workforce development? There's clearly people are worried about making ends meet and finding their children careers in a changing world. How do we articulate that and change the rhetoric around that?
Well, I'll start by saying that I think that there has been actually a sustained assault from a particular wing of politics to attack civic institutions, including the public education system, which I consider to be the most important civic institution in America. And I think that my profession hasn't not covered it properly. They haven't connected the dots. There's been privatization efforts in not just education and transportation and criminal justice and science and everything. And we have seen another layer of philanthropy, billionaires changing the nature of philanthropy and sort of putting their money into what they want as opposed to what experts say is useful. And so I think the public, and then I should say that we had a president in 1980 who said government is the problem. And so what do you think happens to public confidence in civic institutions when government is made to be the bad guy? And I think that there has not been on the other side a full-scale fight against that. And I think I will leave it to my colleagues to talk about how you do that.
I don't think, to the question of the workforce versus the kind of participatory dimension of a public education, I don't think, at least in the elementary and secondary system, that there needs to be a dichotomy between those two things. I don't think we're doing a great job on either front. I think they're both pretty weak tea in the system right now. But I think that good leadership at all levels of the system, and you talk in your book a lot about this, we should talk about governance at some stage of this as well, because that's a messy situation. But good leadership recognizes that there is a dimension of elementary and secondary schooling that is about the common good and the common knowledge. I would argue that it has been our lack of focus on any essential body of knowledge at all that dooms the effect that the elementary and secondary system has on civics and citizenship and so on. And then there is a time at which it becomes imperative on education to advance the economic prospects of its young people. You can't do that, by the way, if you haven't built a strong body of wisdom and knowledge in a young person to begin with. But at a certain point, it's absolutely appropriate for the system to begin thinking and providing options for how young people enter the adult world and for their economic viability. I don't see those two things as in contradiction. Unfortunately, our policymakers, the people who kind of give shape to our system, haven't really, I don't think in any serious way, in quite a long time, probably 20 or 25 years, really reckoned with what the purpose of the system is and what its architecture should be. And as a result, I think you get kind of weak, anodyne answers to both of those questions.
I think in the case of the university, I think for the last several decades, and again, it maybe go to your point, John, is just have we been deliberate enough, intentional enough about calling out the things that are really important and essential for this moment in time? And I think, in a lot of ways for the university, the hyper-specialization of the university, giving more scope for students to craft programs that are highly specialized from the moment they get in a retreat from core requirements and so forth, I think create a backdrop in which these questions are novel in a way of calling the question, have we gone too far? Is there, again, to the point that John's raised, I think there's an ability to actually, in the context, again, of the institution I know best, the university, to have our cake and eat it too. I think you can give experience, a curriculum to our students that gives them a set of capabilities that ultimately will be recognized, rewarded in the marketplace. I think it's possible to do that. But I think it's also simultaneously possible to insist that there are some bedrock ideas, exposures that the students can get that equip them for the responsibilities of citizenship. And again, this requires fortitude on the part of people who are in positions like mine and deans and chairs and so forth to say, do we need to rethink some aspects of the way in which we are discharging our responsibilities so that we can actually get at this moment? But I think fundamentally, what's really striking is a recognition, and it's borne out in a lot of the survey data that have been shared for the last day or two at this conference. But I think there's a shared sense. We're not in a good place. We're not in a good place. And it's kind of in that context, there becomes a responsibility, a challenge to take a look and say, at every institution that plays a role in the fabric of American democracy, what ought we be doing differently? And I think there, too, and in the context of the university, to the extent that we are magnifying at worst or merely leaving intact a lot of the deep divides that our students bring into the university when they enter us, I think it's a lost opportunity that, again, it's incumbent upon us to get at.
So let's come down into the weeds for a moment then, and not let ourselves make abstract statements. So what would be those kinds of things you might see at a university or at the public school level that you might change so that students become more aware of themselves as participating in this great experiment, but also having a sense of their responsibility? I agree with you, it doesn't have to be at odds with preparing for work, but how would you help students start to see that? And what would look different in the K-12 level or at the university level to make that happen?
In K-12, we know that in the 2000s, after No Child Left Behind was passed and implemented, that civics in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, got squeezed out to the emphasis on reading and math, because those were the subjects that were tested. So there really is a dearth of even traditional civics education in America still today. Kids may take one civics course by the time they get out of high school, which is one government course, one civics course, and they've learned how a law, emerges from legislation, how a bill becomes a law. But civics education needs to be far more than facts. I believe kids should learn facts. I think they should learn dates. I think they should learn concepts and processes. But they also have to understand what it means to do. Telling kids, particularly this generation, telling kids is not enough. Kids need to be able to experience it, and I'm not talking about sort of in the common good, sending them out on a discrete service community project where they get to cross it off so they can graduate. If I were in charge, which I will never be.
But that's kind of the question. So.
Right, if I were in charge, students and teachers would have significant roles in the running of schools. Students would have a lot more say about what they learned and how they learned it, after getting input on what makes sense. I think that when I talk to students a lot, different grades, different parts of the country, and many of them just feel like they're robots going from class to class. They have no say in how they learn things, what they learn. A lot of, some classes are fascinating. There's, the idea that public education is a monolith is not true. We have 15,000 systems and they're all different. And I would have democratic small d governance of this. Not exclusively where teachers and students are in charge, but certainly they would play a role. And I think that when you practice democracy, you understand democracy. You start to get the disposition of learning to compromise, understanding you're not going to get everything, but doing the risk evaluation. Well, what if I give this? What do I get that? Kids need to do that, and they don't do that in schools now.
I think, let me start with a stipulation, because I just think this needs to be said. We were, some of us at least, having a conversation in the green room a little bit about this. And this is a mammoth undertaking, what we're describing, and unlikely to succeed in the way that we would all want it to. This society is, in its diversity, in its mammoth scale, in its complexity, and in its current political condition, deeply, deeply fragmented. And when you layer onto that a system that both in higher education and in K-12 is by design highly political and highly fragmented, from a Congress that wants control but exerts really, in fact, minimal control, to states that have ceded their control, to local school systems that are run by political organizations called school boards, 14,000 of them, as Valerie mentioned. That is not a system set up for coherence in any regard. And yet, if I were to wave my magic wand and be in charge of a system that perhaps in some ways I was once in charge of, coherence is what I would want. I agree with Valerie. Civics, we don't need to just sit kids for 45 minutes a week or a day every week for 6 months and expect them to be great citizens. That's not the problem. The problem is some sense of belonging to a thing that has history and roots and land and people and passions and responsibility. And that comes, as it came with the founders, with an education that itself is deep. You have to ask yourself, what does it mean for you and your kids, for me and my kids, to be well educated? It's not taking an 8-week civics course. It's understanding philosophy and its connection to metaphysics and religion, and its connection to science, and its connection to the history of humanity and the natural world and the universe. That's ultimately, if I were to ask one thing of schools, what I would want from them. And the problem is the governments have no interest, as much meddling as there is, in particular on the right, but to an extent on the left too, as much sort of hokey, cheesy meddling as there is today in curriculum. The truth of it is the government has wanted no hands in the curriculum. The curriculum in American schools is weak tea. It skips from subject to subject, some random thing you're assigned to write about your summer vacation. The next week you're reading about horses. The next week you're reading about some random country in Asia. Who knows? There is no coherence to the curriculum. Kids are building no coherent body of knowledge. And then we say, we want you to participate in a society, the history of which you know nothing about. It's far beyond civics. And it's to the root of, are you a well-educated human being?
I would just say that I agree with you about the incoherent curriculum in many places. But it is also true that this country rose to be great with public schools doing that very thing, having very discrete subjects without crossovers. So we have to look at the times. Today, so when you talk about civics, let me explain to you how difficult it is to even agree on what it is. There's been legislation in Congress for a couple of years to give a big infusion of like $1 billion to civics education, and it doesn't get passed. Bipartisan legislation doesn't get passed. Why? Nobody can agree on what they want taught. The idea, and we've seen what's started in Florida with DeSantis and telling teachers what they can and can't teach about the history of racism and race and gender, and now that's spreading. You do have governments now getting involved in curriculum, state governments. And then you have this, and I couldn't make this up. And if you saw it in a parody, you wouldn't believe it. But about, I don't know, a dozen years ago, the Texas GOP had an education platform that said, we will not teach 21st century higher order learning skills, and we will not teach critical thinking because it attacks the fixed views students have, and it goes against what their parents tell them. And it's not just the Texas GOP that thinks that. So, I mean, as you know better than anybody, there's always been an anti-intellectual stream in the United States, and higher education has been under attack by Republicans for a long time as being basically just trying to indoctrinate kids into socialism. So this balkanization you're talking about is extraordinarily huge.
So, if Valerie and John get this right, my job and the job of others of us at the post-secondary level gets a lot easier. And right now, sadly, we're in a position where we're doing a lot of remedial work, given the very significant deficits that our students bring to places like Hopkins. For me, this has been a slow but really terrifying epiphany to understand how incredibly undereducated our students are in just simple, rudimentary ideas, institutions, values that are necessary to drive this democratic experiment. And as so many people have commented on, this isn't inherited through the gene pool. If you don't educate for it, it doesn't happen. And it's really, for me, at the level of the university, it's been striking that, as I've interacted with students over the years and a number of instances to see just the magnitude of the deficit. So let me give you a very concrete example. A number of years ago, when there was this wave of incidents across the United States, wave is probably too strong, but there were several celebrated or notorious incidents of deplatforming, disinvitation of speakers to institutions, which really called into question, the core tenets of academic freedom, freedom of speech, which we see as a central value of higher education, absolutely critical lifeblood for what it is that we do, where you're constantly challenging received wisdom, being exposed to ideas that may be troubling but force you to rethink a position. And a number of us who were heading universities immediately started thinking about what are we going to do in response to this? How can we do some prophylaxis so that your students know what it is to be in a university and to essentially understand that this kind of debate that even makes you deeply uncomfortable, makes you angry, is part of what it means to be in a university community. And so we decided at Hopkins what we would do is right from the get-go, before the students even take a single day of instruction in our orientation period, we give them a 2-hour seminar on academic freedom, free speech, and had a panel of faculty from across the political spectrum talk about why this was so essential for the work that they did. And I must say that when we talked about this panel and so forth, I was really ambivalent. I thought this is going to be pedantic. They've heard it all before. It's just going to have a nature of finger wagging. Is this really going to work, or are we just going to, in some sense, insult them? And actually have this backfire on us. And so I sat at the back of the auditorium when the session was being held, and as the students filed out, I said, so what did you think? The panel discussion went well, there was lots of student engagement, and the students said it was fabulous. So I said, really? And they said, yeah, it was fabulous. I said, well, but you've been exposed to these ideas before, First Amendment, nature of free speech, how it corresponds. And they said, no one ever told us. That was like, no one ever told us. That the number of times that students said, we've got a fabulously accomplished class at Hopkins, high SAT scores, class and so forth, but that they got to us and they didn't have this. So to get to the concrete, I think that one can talk about, and I hope that the various projects that are underway in this country, and I think actually the really interesting ones are bipartisan in character, to build a common curriculum, and it shows that it is possible to do. But as K-12 gets fixed, I think, or while we're waiting for it to be fixed, I think we got to step in and do things like insisting on exposure to ideas of democracy, whether in the formal curriculum and a host of supplementary activities we build around the students. I think these are really important ways in which we discharge the responsibility. And I should also say, and just want to put in another dimension to this, is how we educate. The nature of our curricula, the kind of atmosphere we create is all important, but also equally important is whom we're educating. And here, one of the things that I think as we look at the pummeling trust and the pummels to trust that we are taking, and the precipitous decline in levels of trust that higher education enjoys in this country, I think the composition of our student bodies is part of the thing that we've got to address as much as curriculum. So, for instance, that there are 40 top research universities in this country where there are more students from the top 1% of the socioeconomic distribution in the country than the bottom 60%, again, is something that undermines our capacity to educate American citizens and to enjoy the trust of the country.
K-12 right now is majority minority. And there are more poor kids going to public schools now. There are more first-generation kids going to school now. And there is not an increase in resources to deal with the many issues that they come to school with. And then again, when we talk about civics, what are the dispositions are we talking about? Yes, knowing that the parts of the government are important, but is learning to live in a multicultural society and respecting people who are different from you, is that a civic value that we hold dear? Some people do, some people don't. So coming to an agreement on what civics is and what these dispositions are is increasingly more difficult as the country becomes more divided. And part of that, again, is misinformation, the misinformation explosion that Americans didn't have back before the rise of technology. They got bad information sometimes, but everybody kind of got the same information from 3 networks. The rise of technology has been wonderful in some ways, and it's been very damaging in other ways. And I think it's helped create kind of some of these, the lack of connection. Somebody brought up the word connection, and that is absolutely central to everybody living in a democracy, that you feel connected to it. And you have generations of kids who feel connected to nothing.
So, wow, there's so many strains to pick up on that I'm trying to think about it. But one, I want to pick up on this idea of connection because John, you raised it as well, that people don't see themselves as part of something larger. They don't feel connected, that being a citizen is not just, we've been talking about curriculum, what do people need to know? We've been talking about dispositions and values, what the founders call virtues. But it has to be somehow that people feel like they're part of something. We live in a complex, diverse, polarized society, a decentralized system. In many ways, the complement of what we've been talking about is the shift away from curricula and coherence and content towards skills. And that came out of both the progressive left thinking about what it means to learn and downplaying subject matter, but it also came from the failures of efforts of national standards. Similar critiques are made about universities being kind of checkbox and whatever. But some of that reflects our inability to sort of figure out what's this larger thing that we all belong to. So is that part of the challenge we're facing? Is that schooling is inherently political? We've had common school systems, and we need a commonness to have a common good, but yet we're struggling to find our way to how to describe and make young people feel they're part of something. And even as adults, we don't always know what that thing is anymore.
Yeah, I think so. And by the way, I think we were also talking a little bit about this. We shouldn't place all of the onus on schools to be the source of reconciliation for all of these social ailments. I mean, isolation, fragmentation, these are now tragically a kind of part of the American condition, and to a degree a part of the global condition for reasons that both of my colleagues have discussed. And I don't think schools are going to solve all of that. Certainly sitting in a classroom is not going to solve all of that. You have issues at home, greater fragmentation, the way that we live and our habits and our geographic orientation is more fragmented than ever before, and that's a huge deal. But yes, no question that schools play a role in it, and part of the challenge is, to some of the points you've made in your book, you have a Congress that has, by virtue of not having an education mandate, only certain levers. You have states in whom the powers rest, but whose political incentives, for better or for worse, and I'd say for worse, are really to kind of hand the locals the authorities to run their schools and determine their own learning environments. And then you have locals that are inherently parochial, and I don't say that critically, just as a matter of fact. And so the question of to what does one belong, if it is that we are asking a question of citizenship and obligation to your fellow citizens, is a really, really hard question. And I was thinking about this on my way here. I don't really know if you accept that the majority of students are going to continue to go to the public K-12 system and really the public higher education system. If you accept that as a fact, then you're accepting the system must be where the solution by and large resides. And so somewhere within the system, there has to be responsible leadership that tries to reconcile this inherently fragmented, messy, scaled system. And if there's anything that I'm concerned about, it's that where there was that institutional leadership, I would say, and I don't mean, Valerie, to overly romanticize these days, but let's call it 30 or 40 years ago, where at the dawn of the kind of standards-based education reform movement, at the zenith of the Cold War, and a time when we were living with the successes and failures of the civil rights movement more intimately, people came together across the aisle, non-governmental and governmental institutions, and states worked together to build an architecture for what they thought would be a promising plan to cohere without disrespecting those lines of local authority. Now, you can say that movement, and that was a sweeping shift in the Reagan and first Bush administrations, but you can say that it was a success or not, but what it showed was a hope that through the power of leadership, we could advance the education system. Probably my greatest concern in the elementary and secondary system sitting here today is not ultimately that some governor is doing something silly to meddle with a curriculum or certain racist politicians. Tragically, there have always been that kind of silliness. What there isn't right now, though, is an obvious place to point to say, I can see the kernels of a national school of thought emerging for the future. And in a world that obviously is experiencing what we're experiencing globally, technologically, you would hope that that would be the case. The kernels of progress in the elementary and secondary system have always come from states, at least for the past century. And we don't see that here today, and that gives me great concern. States working with outside governmental institutions, working across states to foment a national agenda, not a top-down agenda, to foment a state-led national agenda, not present, and it's of great concern.
The national agenda, though, the standards movement, yeah, go ahead.
I'll take it.
The standards movement, there's no research that shows that standards education actually moves a needle.
That's not entirely true, but we can
debate that. What Reagan did in 1983 was put out a report that basically said that that public education writ large was awful and destroying the economy, which also isn't true. There's also there are valid questions about how much public education actually drives the economy. When the economy was great during Bill Clinton's era, nobody said thank you, public schools. Nobody said that. They only attack public schools when the economy's bad. But my point is that in the last 40 years, what we have seen is a movement to run schools like they're businesses. That's been one of the predominant reforms that we've seen in schools. And the idea of running a civic institution like it's a business and kids are products has failed predictably, because you can't run a civic institution and like a business. And I think we've seen a lot of damage done by that movement.
I just want to take issue with that slightly. I would say that the theme of the last 40 years, and I agree with Valerie, you can debate how it's worked and how it hasn't. I think it's worked in some ways, the research has shown, and not in others, has been to actually try to say there are things schools are meant to achieve, and we are going to quantifiably verify whether they have been achieved, and we're going to assign responsibility to some adult for whether they have or haven't been achieved. And quite frankly, in the absence of that, you just didn't know. And in the absence of that, a lot of bad stuff happened, including, by the way, segregating schools and segregating resources. And I'm not saying that those things have been eradicated. Absolutely. But it was an attempt to remedy it, whether it succeeded or not. And I don't think that just saying we can't have standards, we can't have measurement, we can't have accountability, and I'm not saying that's what Valerie's saying, but is the answer.
Right, yes.
What I do think, though, we have failed to do is we have fetishized, and you asked this in some of our earlier discussion, we have fetishized measurement, and what we haven't done enough of is to actually get to the essence of the substance of schooling and the degree to which it's being manifested in classrooms. That was the hope of the standards movement that hasn't been realized, and that's an unfortunate outcome.
I agree with that. We have absolutely fetishized assessment to a remarkably uncomfortable degree, and it has harmed education. It's harmed a couple of generations. If you identify generation as 15 years, I guess it's 30 years, whatever it is. It's harmed a lot of kids. It's harmed a lot of teachers. Public education has, in the last 20 years, been through a series of probably well-meaning reforms that have been very damaging.
I don't normally, as a faculty member, say, let's make sure the president of the university gets time, but I want to give you a chance.
What I'm saying may speak to what he is saying, which is that he's seeing kids come through without basic knowledge that he expected them to have.
How do you address, you talk about this in your book as well, this sort of sense that people have to feel they're part of something, and universities have some relationship to our democracy?
So I think it starts, first and foremost, I think the issues around system design and coherence, which I think are very different at the K-12 level from where you are at a university, where I can't imagine that we would, even at a state level, but certainly not at a national level, imagine defining common curricula and so forth that we would adhere to. In terms of thinking about the particular deficits that we're identifying here. Having said that, I think the system in the United States is amazingly responsive and innovative at the K-12 level in some dimensions, and certainly in the post-secondary domain. And what I think is important is that the challenge be taken seriously. How you think about the role of higher education and the responsibilities of citizenship at this particular moment in time. And here, what's really interesting is how different institutions are responding in different ways to meeting that challenge. Purdue University under Mitch Daniels decided that basically you needed to have a standard test that students would have to pass before they could graduate from university that would test democratic competencies. And there were a number of ways in which you could get the knowledge, the capacity to be able to score well on that test before you graduate. That's interesting. Stanford University has moved in a different direction, trying to build these ideas into a first-year curriculum. We're doing something similar at Hopkins. What I think is important is that we recognize this challenge of fragmentation and how we as institutions are going to use our moment. And particularly, I think it's important to remind ourselves, in a country where there's no obligation to national service, we have these students for 4 years, and we're increasingly creating more and more interesting and heterogeneous student bodies, where in some sense we have an opportunity not just to educate in the formal curriculum, but to give the students the capacities, the techniques, the exposures to meeting people who are wholly different from them, and how we sort of work through these challenges of pluralism and do so without sort of retreating into our layers. And so I think there's lots of ways in which, if we take the challenges seriously, I can imagine the various institutions responding to them in different ways, but nevertheless doing so in a way that is serious and purposeful. I'll just say it even goes to things like living arrangements for our students. One of the things that's happened over the last several decades is that when students come to university, it's been true for the past past 2 decades, students basically self-select whom they're going to live with in advance of coming to university. So we've got these incredibly diverse communities, but surprise, surprise, when students, particularly through social media, are able to find their roommates for a first year, they find typically students who look and think just like they do. This is a way in which, if you're going to take seriously, we have this moment in America where we've got real diversity in our student bodies. We should put an end to that, and we did at Hopkins. We basically put the students together, randomly assigned roommates, rather than letting them do that themselves. And at first there was a bit of backlash against this, but it's really interesting. 2 years into the experiment, the students are saying, we get it, and this has actually forced us out of our comfort zones, which I think is part, again, of what a holistic educative experience means.
That's a good story.
That is a great story. Yeah, I love that. And
I
I think the self-selection into segregated communities as college freshmen.
Well, it's just we know this country, we live with a great separation. So you know that basically, the students are coming in where they just haven't had those exposures, and so then, what do? We've got them for 4 years, and we let them self-replicate exactly what they're. That's a lost opportunity. So again, I think it's this sense of trying to take this comprehensive approach to the problem that isn't just thinking about the civics course or the democracy course, but it's more than that.
Can I just pick up on that for a second,
Please.
Johann? Because I think that probably between Ron's perch and then at least I'll speak for myself, mine, down in the swamps, literally and figuratively, of K-12 education, there's a group of kids that we're missing who I think in some sense maybe are the most vulnerable in this kind of question of coherence, belonging, and citizenship. And that is that we really don't have a high school dropout crisis in this country any longer. You can say what you will about why that is, but we graduate huge numbers of kids from high school relative to what was the case 20 or 30 years ago. But what has that meant for those kids? Not much, unfortunately. For a huge percentage of kids, they're now eligible for the higher education system because they have a high school diploma, but they're really not eligible for the rigors of a conventional, even associate, much less baccalaureate education. And you have this, and you can say that it's rhetoric. I think in some sense sometimes it is, but from the commercial world, it's saying you don't need to have a college degree to come and work for us. And so there is this kind of lingering thing with a huge number of kids, and there's plenty of evidence to show this, who are fundamentally disconnected. They are 18 to 21, but they have a high school diploma. They are Pell Grant eligible. And yet there really isn't a supply of what I'll call, Ron, higher education models that are appropriate for a young person who actually does need to immediately have a full-time job, who actually needs to immediately get a toehold, whose wage path probably won't support any significant debt load. And just saying, which I think often people in political life say, well, the community colleges will kind of handle this. I don't see a lot of evidence of that either, especially coming out of the pandemic. Adolescence has been, and I'm sure no one knows this better than a college president, university president, has been totally disrupted. For low-income kids of color, immeasurably disrupted. And how we provide a path that is beyond just, well, I suppose you can get a job at Taco Bell, for that young person, a path to upward mobility, I think, at least in the way it's set up today, has to run through higher education. And this says nothing about Johns Hopkins. But I don't, by the way, which I'm an alum of proudly, but I don't see the conventional higher education system or the conventional high school system claiming that young person and saying, we will bring you into economic viability, we will bring you into adult viability. And so in some sense, as much as we talk about kind of the lofty issues of curriculum and knowledge and so on, I am really concerned about just the participation in civic and economic life of that mass of kids in Louisiana who have a high school diploma but aren't headed to LSU, and for whom the system has no real obvious path. More problematic today than ever before.
Well, that raises a question, actually. Can I just...
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And I think that question is that, you know, one of the things I was thinking about as education came up over and over again, and all of us right now on this stage write, think, act, love education. So far be it for me to say I was sad about that. But you're raising a question which is in some ways suggesting that we're kicking we adults, policymakers, voters are kicking a lot of cans down the road by just saying education will solve it. And this came up a little earlier. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like in some parts you're saying actually the kind of crisis of belonging, of democracy, of civic and economic life is not something that we can it's almost an evasion to say, just go to college. The college is the answer for everything, just like it might have been to say at some point high school is the answer to everything. So are we using education as a kind of way of not having to deal with other issues, or because we all agree education is important?
I think that education is as important as people make it. It is not the answer to everything. It can never be the answer to everything. Going back to what he was saying, what John was saying is that in the 80s and then the 90s and the 2000s, the idea was, well, everybody should go to college. Let's everybody get them college ready. They said college and career, but they got rid of vocational education. And they basically made it, they did not respect the kind of brain power that has to go into vocational education. And that's been a crisis in America. You have to have a lot of smarts to be a plumber. But that's not what America did with its education system. It was college or bust. And so I think what happens is some of those kids who were told to go to college, maybe, and this isn't just poor kids, this is any kids, would have been better off having the path of vocational education. So that was that was one of the avenues I think that got closed off. I would like to come back to the idea of communication, of connection, because I don't think anything good happens without people feeling connected. I was at a conference this past weekend, and I met some kids, and the principal of a high school in Maryland called Pocomoke on the Eastern Shore. It was the last school in Maryland to desegregate. It violated federal mandates to desegregate for years, and finally it did. Now it's mostly poor kids, it's mostly minority kids. It is located in a fairly violent area, and there's no violence in school. And the kids graduate at very high rates. And the thing that started this, they say, is when the principal decided to start painting on the wall the faces of all 3,000 kids. who go to the school every year, and every adult in the building who had a relationship with one of them would put their initials. And the kids who didn't have initials got connected to somebody. And that started changing the culture of the school. Kids felt connected. Now, part of the problem with this is that we've made teachers' lives so hard in K-12. We don't pay them, there aren't enough. We give them scripts to read and don't respect their expertise. As you were talking about, the importance of expertise has been diminished in the United States. But I was so taken by this effort to connect. And the truth is, every school could do that. So when you're talking about how do you do things, that's just a granular way of starting something. That's doable.
Yeah.
So, I want to go back to, John, some of the things that you said around thinking about the various pathways that are available for students, particularly coming from very seriously disadvantaged backgrounds, and how do we think about that at the post-secondary level? At one level, if one looks at community colleges in this country and sees the incredibly high attrition rates and the extent to which students are starting, not finishing, I just think there's so much urgency around really getting our heads wrapped around what accounts for the continuing chronic problems with a lot of our community colleges in this country. And I think the failure to really address the performance of, again, it's not that there aren't great community colleges, but if one looks at it as a system, the failure of community colleges to really equip students, first of all, graduate them, and then equip them for entry into the workforce is, I think, lamentable. And again, I see it in very simple terms, just around in my wanderings through different states and seeing even the extent to which relatively rudimentary governance mechanisms, like having a set of local or regional employers be tapped into the governing bodies of these schools so they can ensure there's alignment between what the students are being exposed to, the kind of curriculum and internship opportunities they get, and what employers at the end. It just seems, some of this seems really simple, and yet we can't solve for it. So I think that's a really important issue for us to get our arms wrapped around. At the same time, I don't want to evade the responsibility that we have, even in elite higher education, for thinking about what's our role in thinking about the pathways that students from disadvantage will be able to pursue that takes them to an institution like ours and doesn't just get them there, but gets them to graduate on time and to have an experience that is parallel to their students who come from affluence. Again, if you're going through our institutions and you've got to work 20 hours a week and you've got a set of financial responsibilities to your family that is really distracting you, it's not fair. It's not a level playing field. So how we think about this move, which I think has been really laudable, that's happened in higher education over the last decade, where there's been much greater sensitivity to enrolling, enticing Pell-eligible students into our institutions, and seeing that once they're there, that they really flourish, and thinking about all the kinds of supplementary programming supports that recognizes the reality of having students that are coming from, as is the case at Hopkins today, we have students coming from high schools in Appalachia where they are literally one of a small handful of students that are even going on to university, let alone an elite research university. And they're being put into a setting where they're cheek by jowl with students who have had every advantage in life, who have had all the great summer experiences, the travel experiences, the internship experiences, at a really rigorous private education, plus a lot of APs. And now we're saying you're all together, and just assuming that without more, that's going to ensure that they have a fair shot at really being able to succeed. And I think it's been really striking the extent to which, as the Pell population, and in some measure this is because the U.S. News and World Report started actually using Pell participation in determining the ranking of an institution, that it really fueled this movement to universities taking that population much more seriously. But as we're getting much larger Pell populations, or students who are the first generation of their family to go to university, what's been great is to see the extent to which universities have really understood, all the supports that are necessary to ensure that they succeed. And the final thing I'll just say is the interesting connection. And I just left a meeting at the American Association of University Presidents, where there was a fair amount of discussion around how you get the right articulation agreements and so on, so that you can actually find that students who start off in community college, where the pathway, the pipeline to university is less understood, and to find ways of enticing those students after 1 or 2 years of community college to then come and take their credential and join our institutions. And again, I think that's another way in which you can increase these pathways for opportunity for disadvantaged students.
I think, and that is probably more of a watershed in terms of elite institutions taking responsibility, as you said, Ron, for Pell-generating students or Pell-eligible students. The signaling power, if nothing else, that has to the rest of us is immense and should not be undervalued. This is a technical issue, but it may kind of speak to a broader one. At the community college level, where the majority of kids, say at a Baton Rouge community college in my state, are Pell eligible, that Pell grant is not just a kind of sort of thing for some students. It's the organizing principle. It's the financial lifeblood, in some sense, of the place. And as a result, what you end up with is an institution that is behaving in the most conventional ways, curriculum-wise, for a student who actually needs something, I think, that looks more like a national service program. And on the left, there is a kind of nostalgia, I think, about community colleges. And on the right, I think there is a kind of nostalgia about workforce training programs. And neither really holds up. The truth of it is, the average 18-year-old is who's not going to a university, even the ones who are going to university, but certainly the ones who are not, is a very, very difficult constituent to deal with. There are not many employers that are saying, I'm going to invest and hope in the future of a non-college attending 18-year-old. And there are not many community colleges who have shown the wherewithal to promote the upward mobility of that person. Consequently, we have a very, very disengaged, low-income, non-college going population of high school graduated 18 to 20-year-olds. The hegemony of the Pell Grant needs to shift in the way that it controls community college behaviors. And we need a model that frankly looks a little bit, certainly doesn't need to be militaristic, but that looks a little bit more like the holistic supports provided by our armed services, I think. My brother is also a Hopkins graduate, but an enlisted person in the military.
It gets better and better.
It gets better and better. And to see what they do when they think about their young sailors, he's in the Navy, and to see how much greater that is than what we provide the average high school graduate just goes to show there could be a model of providing a more immediate path to education and to belonging than there is for our average high school graduate who walks across a dais just like this in May in Louisiana and pretty much into a system of nothingness too often.
I will say that there are a lot of colleges that accept students from low-income families, minority families, first-generation families, and don't provide the kind of wraparound services that they need. And so you have a fairly high dropout rate broadly from those students because not enough schools step up to that. They certainly don't. Many schools don't have programs for disabled students with disabilities. So that's still an enormous problem in higher ed and frankly in K-12. It's the support systems.
I want to ask one more question and then turn to the questions that have been coming in from people listening. And that has to do with the recent UVA Mount Vernon poll. And one of the things that came out is that there's bipartisan agreement on a lot of things about what public education should be and what civic education can be. Most Americans by far think American schools should encourage free thinking and debate. Most Americans by far say school curricula should include the achievements and injustices of our nation's history. Most Americans by far want civic education. And then it comes to whether Americans think the schools are doing a good job, and you have a minority from both parties. Similarly, we've seen recent polls suggesting that general trust in all American institutions, but including K-12 and universities, has been going down more rapidly over the last few years. For a long time, you couldn't dislodge trust in local public schools because everybody was invested in them, and that transferred to general trust in the schools themselves. That's starting to change. Why do you think, if education is so important, it comes up all the time, why do you think confidence in our schools and universities and trust in our schools and universities is so low? Is this just a factor of partisan politics? Do you think the institutions themselves play a role? And what do we do about that?
So why don't I take a run at this? I think it's absolutely the case that to the extent that you have a strain of authoritarian populism running through the veins of this country right now, the antipathy to higher education, maybe even to basic education, and the sense that this is elite, that it's distant, that it's unresponsive, that it is designed to create a graduate that is going to only think in progressive terms and so forth. I think it can't help, that environment can't help, but in some sense shape attitudes, and not surprisingly, negative attitudes towards education and towards our institutions. So I think that is part of the story. And it doesn't help, when you've got elected senators saying things like, the university is the enemy. This is our J.D. Vance. Hillbilly elegy. It's literally has declared that universities are the enemy in the United States. So this is not helpful. But having said that, that doesn't absolve us of responsibility to think, what our responsibility is? Have we done anything to contribute to this state of affairs? And again, when I go back to the failure to take seriously the responsibility of generating students who are capable of properly discharging the responsibilities of citizenship, when you look at the failures to properly cultivate the spirit of pluralism that I think we should be doing at post-secondary educations when you've got these diverse student bodies, or when you think about these patterns of who gets in. And an issue that that I have been very critical of is the continuation of programs like legacy admissions. The idea that we're actually giving students a significant bump up in the competition to get to universities solely by virtue of the fact that their parents or grandparents went to the institution, that's something that runs absolutely nakedly against core ideas of equal opportunity that I've always thought were at the bedrock of this country. So it's not all on us, but it doesn't mean that nothing's on us. And I think, again, if we're going to take this moment seriously, it goes back to the responsibility to look self-critically and think about what are the things that we could be doing differently that we could address with some determination and fortitude so that we can hopefully arrest and restore some of the, as I said, precipitous decline in the level of confidence in higher education.
Thank you.
I think you have a powerful segment of philanthropists and of politicians who don't believe in public education. 30 years ago, some activists, when I started the education beat, yes, I've been doing it a long time, came to me and said there are people trying to kill public education, like Betsy DeVos and her husband. And I said, nah, that can't be right. How can that be right? They probably just have a different view of how education should be done. And then I went to a press conference where John Walton and Ted Forsman were announcing the start of the first of a scholarship program, a voucher program in DC, which eventually became the only federally funded voucher program. And I asked him, I had Ted Forsman and said, do you want to destroy the public education system? And I thought he'd laugh and say, don't be silly. And he said, yes, I don't believe in it. And that's when I learned that there is a movement to do that. When Donald Trump became president, his inauguration speech equated public education with carnage in the streets and gangs. That was in the same sentence. Before she became education secretary, Betsy DeVos called public education a dead end, quote unquote. Jeb Bush and like-minded politicians call public schools, K-12 schools, presumably, I don't know about public universities, but K-12 schools, union-run government monopolies. There has been a concerted effort to undermine public education.
Valerie, can I just ask you, though,
Sure.
when you say public education, I'm interested in understanding what it is you mean by that. So, like, I could imagine that public education means publicly provided, state-provided education. But I could also imagine that public education could be state-subsidized through a choice system or so forth education.
Well, right.
So the concern about the diminution of the public character of K-12 education, does it also include state finance, but nevertheless choice-driven education?
No, it doesn't, because when you're talking about choice schools, if you talk about private schools, you're talking about a very different enterprise. Students check their civil rights at the gate. Voucher programs they're allowed to discriminate against black kids, kids with gender, they're allowed to discriminate legally. That is not a public function. Discrimination should not be allowed with public money. But that's what's happening with all these voucher programs. So the answer is no. Yes, we have that, publicly funded private choice schools. We have that, but do I consider that public education? I don't. Betsy DeVos does. Ron DeSantis does. They both tweeted on the same day several years ago, well, if it's public money, it's public education. So the Catholic school that gets public money is considered public education to these people. Not to me.
You want to add something to that?
I think that first, as just a response directly to your question, I think schools are just generally, and the education kind of establishment generally, is probably, when it comes to politics and ideology, more a function and a laggard when it comes to the broad sweep of politics and ideology than a driver. Universities have a special place, in particular, such esteemed institutions as a place like Hopkins, in fomenting thinking. But the 75,000 schools of this country are not themselves progenitors of politics and ideology in any distinct way. So I think when people respond to those questions, with all respect to the respondents, I think they are, in some sense, seeing their view of the world through the lens of schools rather than kind of clearly distinguishing schools from the rest of the world. That said, and I take issue with some of what Valerie said, not because I disagree with all of it intellectually, so much as when I think about what to be critical of in the system, what to improve in the system, I find these discussions over vouchers or this text versus another, yes, symbolically they're important, but in terms of really where the kids are, I choose to direct my energy toward perhaps incremental improvements, but within the massively scaled establishment, than to direct my energies toward what I would still consider more boutique and niche dimensions of our politics. Vouchers I have a particular take on, which is I believe in choice markets, but I believe in them being highly regulated, and regulated use of the public trust being the appropriate way of thinking about them. But at the same time, when I think about how to improve the lot of the 800,000 kids in the education system in Louisiana, that's not the first place my mind goes. My mind goes toward the basic question of how the institution's running. And if I were to critique my friends who I would say are distinctly on the right or distinctly on the left, they are spending increasingly more and more and more time not focused on fundamentally reforming institutions and more time thinking about boutique issues that have a lot of political novelty. And if anything, I find that troublesome. Reforming public institutions, whatever manifestation they have in terms of public-private schooling, public institutions takes time, it takes hard work, it takes courage, it takes conviction, it takes patience. And that's ultimately where we should be. Those of us who have been blessed with all of the things that we four have been blessed with, and probably most everybody here, should be spending our time, in my view, working to make the institutions better because they are where the citizenry is.
Can I just say that the very first thing, if you're going to reform anything, as I agree it should be, as you say, we have a funding system that is inherently unequal. And as long as that persists, you will always have the winners and losers. You will not be able to do the kinds of things you want for the populations that need them. And we haven't talked about that, but public funding is inequitable. And you can make all kinds of changes, but unless you get at the root, you're going to still have massive problems.
So I have a question that comes from someone in the audience which picks up on these themes, and it's a question about specifically referring to North Carolina's embrace of vouchers, but other states have, and you've moved in some of these states to slowly moving to a more universal voucher system. And one of the things I was thinking about as all of you were talking, I was thinking about the way that, Ron, you said, on campus, students used to be able to choose affinity houses based on interest or religion or ethnicity, and now you actually want people to be mixed up in a common spaces so that we have pluralistic people in common spaces. And, of course, in the 1800s, these were the common schools. That model is still there for the public schools. How do we reconcile, I know you said that you think this is a fringe issue, but as policymakers are embracing this at a larger level and making it accessible to more citizens, how do we balance the sort of pluralistic tendencies, the self-segregating tendencies, not just because people are racist or elitist, but also because of the kinds of choices people will make of other kinds, and this sort of ideal that's sort of been expressed in different ways by all of you of having a common curriculum, diverse people in common institutions. Are vouchers a threat to that? Can they make that more likely?
Well, for the reasons Valerie just said, the current system, the current residential system, it's both residents in the way that residential policy and housing patterns exist, as well as the real estate taxes, the property taxes that they drive. Let's start the discussion about segregation and fragmentation there. The current system, and I'm not saying anybody, is to blame per se, but that system is the de facto source of segregation. Now, you can put that on steroids if you create a worse kind of market dynamic, one that's not sensitive to the imperative to integrate, and one that's not sensitive to the imperative to quality. But you can also use markets to help dig us out of some of that. That's unfortunately a highly intransigent American condition, that middle income, upper income, lower income peoples tend to be segregated, some by no choice of their own. And yet markets, if the size of, say, the subsidy, the purchasing power is legit, the barriers to entry are lowered, that actually can help us get out of this. I live in a state where a third of the kids are educated in Catholic schools. Now that's a unique in a district where a third of the kids are educated in Catholic schools. That's a unique thing. But Catholic schooling, in our context, can be a source of socioeconomic and racial integration if the market is created in a way where the barriers to entry are lowered and where the subsidies are such that the incentives and the purchasing power is strengthened. So I think, again, this kind of comes back to leadership. Now, to be fair, I think a lot of the rhetoric on the right about the kind of dogma of markets and about religious liberties being exercised through school choice, or just about, as Valerie says, in some cases, just tearing down writ large, the public education system, yeah, I think that's deeply problematic. And I was saying this to Valerie, though, earlier. I find it, though, also a little strange that for those of us who maybe lean a little bit left, we might say, in the way we think about policy and civic liberties and so on, why there has become this kind of de facto antagonism toward markets and school choice as a policy lever, when the whole agenda is supposed to be about equality and social justice. I'll say this to close. I went to St. Albans. I went to Beauvoir and St. Albans, for those of you familiar with these places, from kindergarten through 12th grade. I had a voucher. It's called My Dad's a Corporate Lawyer voucher. And I have never had anybody explain to me why we shouldn't want, given appropriate regulatory conditions, another young person who didn't have that means to have the same level of access that I had. I just have never heard a good answer to that question. And if that's true, then we have to at least want to explore the possibility.
But I think this is, John, I just really want to jump on this because it's very sympathetic to the point you're making here, which is, it goes back to the concern you raised earlier, Valerie, about the extent to which we have discredited government as the place where actually these crucial decisions are made. That is to say, markets don't arise spontaneously. Markets have rules. There are so many different ways in which markets have some degree of regulation, some degree of choice that has been made by the state and how those markets will operate. And it seems to me, again, when you look at both the aspirations of left and right as to what they want to see in education, it's hard for me to imagine that there aren't some set of choices that government can make in setting the bedrock rules under which that choice system will operate, that people will say these are still intrinsically public responsibilities that are being discharged. There's nothing inherent in saying you're going to have some system of choice and competition, which necessarily means that you leave the public interest out of the equation. And indeed, when you are investing public funds in this system, it seems to me that it's incumbent upon government to make precisely those bedrock decisions as to where you're going to tolerate elements of discrimination and choice in the way in which you generate a student body, what kind of supplementary support you need for students with special needs and so forth. All of these issues are they're devilishly complicated, but they're issues that can be, I think, made by government in a way that is publicly accountable and honors the obligation to the public interest.
I think that's dreaming. I'll be honest with you.
But is it dreaming any more than when people say, oh, can't we all just have neighborhood schools? It's not so easy to say in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, I just want a neighborhood school.
But we have had neighborhood schools. We did have them for a very, very long time.
Well, most places still have them.
Markets are meant to make money. The market economy is about money. And if you think you can have the government instill the notion of the common good in a market, I'd love to live to see the day to see that, but I don't think I will.
But Valerie, so many, if you look at so many ways in which the state actually discharges its responsibility in terms of the core entitlements of the social welfare state, it actually delegates funds responsibilities to the private sector, but critically, the not-for-profit private sector.
It does, that's true.
So, there's a lot of not-for-profit actors, even if you have some, I think, appropriate skepticism of the for-profit motivation, but there's a lot of really good not-for-profit providers who I think are not motivated by the profit imperative as much as they're really motivated by impact. So that
I am sure that's true. If you want to look at the current state of the choice movement, that is not, the case is that it is as mixed as the traditional public school system. It has not helped with inequality. It has not helped, certain schools do better than others, just like the traditional public school system. So now what you have are just different layers of school systems. It hasn't solved any problem. Maybe for some individual kids, yes, but if you're talking on a systems basis, it hasn't. And what you have, the people, some of the people, the people who support choice are not monolithic either. A lot of them have very different views of it. They support parts of it. They don't support other parts of it. But the people on the far extreme are trying to push education in America back before the common school movement. They want everything to be private. They don't want the government to be involved. They don't want regulation. Betsy DeVos doesn't want the government telling private schools what to do. They'd never go for that. That's not what they want.
I think what you're saying is true. I think that strain of the school choice movement is there. I think we should reject it. And I unqualified agree. The only thing I would just say to those of us who came to the education side of the world out of a concern for civil liberties and civil rights is we should be concerned with the kind of satisfaction of those who critique the choice movement, but then say, I'm doing it in the name of neighborhood schools, when we can all acknowledge that neighborhoods have not all been equally positioned to succeed.
True. So why wasn't the push on changing funding? Why was the push on creating new schools that people that some companies make enormous profits from, charter schools? Why wasn't the push for equality on changing funding?
I think you could, I don't know what you mean by why wasn't, but
there's never been a movement among school reformers to broadly change the property tax base of funding. Now, in certain places it has.
I think that it is a very fair critique of American school reform that the questions of governance and the questions of tax sources and tax uses have not been central to, let's call it in 30 years, state-level reform agendas. I think that is a very fair critique.
So I have a couple other questions, even though I think we could have this conversation for a very long time. One person asked, as a former high school teacher, are there ways to attract more qualified teachers and improve teacher training? That also presumes at some level that's maybe a need. And so I would ask both, is that a need? And do you have thought about ways to do that?
In the history of our country, every person elected president.
There's the answer to your question.
Yeah.
Yes,
I was going to say, our timer gives us a little more time, but I thought they'd use the cane when they were done.
I think that our political class is flummoxed by this issue because it's one of those that is structurally challenging. It deals with a lot of the issues we're talking about. I think it addresses Valerie's concern about equity of funding. You really see it manifest in a way mostly in the compensation of the adults. That's where 85% of our industry's money goes. And I think it goes to the issue of markets. To be fair, we in the policy realm have not really been very attentive to the issue of markets in trying to arrive at a competitive workforce. The gap between bachelor's holding workers who are teachers and all the other bachelor's holding workers has always been pronounced, but it's gotten worse. That's partially because of outsized distributions to the commercial private sector bachelor's worker, but it's also because we have saturated our workforce with millions and millions of people, and I mean that literally, and have divided up a pie that, equity issues notwithstanding, is growing. We do invest a lot in education in this country relative to our peer developed nations around the world, but we have divided that pot up into more and more and more adults, and you're going to see evidence of that, by the way. After the federal stimulus goes away, there will be a retrenchment, and a lot of our workforce challenges that we perceive to have will be, I don't want to call them resolved, but they won't be as pronounced as they were when the system was sloshing around with money. Which all is to say, we have more control over this issue than we say, but it takes leadership. You actually have to want to look at the full distribution of talent, the standards by which we bring talent in, and we have to set some aspiration as to how competitive we want to be with other industries. Governors are the chief regulators. This used to be an issue, whatever one thought of them in the Dick Riley and Buddy Roemer days of the Southern education governors, Bill Clinton days of Southern education governors. This was the central issue in the Southern resurgence of education policy. It's been a long time since this has really been taken seriously. Right now, you've got a bunch of governors just writing $2,000 and $3,000 checks a year to people as if that's going to change their lives in a day of 5% inflation. So it's not a serious piece of our policy portfolio, and it should be.
Do either of you have anything to add? No. Then I will move on to the next question, which, Ron, I think this might be for you, is how do you encourage growth in humanities and social sciences with mounting pressures on students for return on investment?
So I think it starts first and foremost with a sense that that background in humanities and social sciences, even if we're going to bring the test of marketability to the equation, I think that still, maybe not in your first job, but I think over time that the training, the exposure, the skills you develop, critical capacity, the kind of emphasis on creativity and so forth that you get in some of these disciplines, I think serve you very well in the marketplace. So on the test of the utilitarian calculus, I think one can make a case. Having said that, to the extent that's not completely persuasive as against students who are going into engineering or to business as undergraduates, I think that what's been really interesting is the way in which the universities have evolved and provided more opportunities for students to double major, to do a major in philosophy while at the same time you do a business major or minor. And what we're seeing, a trend that it's been really, I think, heartening for me at Hopkins, is to see the number of our students who are doing still majors in the social sciences and humanities, but nevertheless coupling it with these other majors, minors, where they're essentially being readied for more marketable opportunities on graduation, but not abandoning the kind of insight and the exposure you get through those traditional subjects. So I will say at Hopkins, we are doubling down on both of those broad domains, and at the same time that we're of course supporting investments in the STEM-related fields, we're expanding the size of our humanities and social science departments, and just believe that ultimately there is market interest on the part of our students for those domains, and more than that, as a university that is determined to be relevant to and to foster the strength of this country, it's essential that we keep those disciplines strong and vibrant.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think that that perspective is shared by other college presidents across the country or legislators?
I think it varies. Yeah, there's clearly there are states in which the legislature or the executive have decided that we don't need to educate in the humanities or the social sciences anymore, and so to shift faculty positions, resources into these other fields. I think that's tragic, and I think, again, an abdication of responsibility. And indeed, what's even really, I think, encouraging for me is to see the extent to which even students who are doing majors in disciplines like the life sciences, the engineering sciences, and so forth, are understanding that even to be effective in their fields upon graduation, it is essential that they get exposure to the humanities and social sciences. Think about the students who are learning the techniques of CRISPR technology and being able to do gene editing and all the power that portends in terms of making choices for humanity, not to be able to locate those decisions in the context of a broader exposure to the humanities and social sciences, I think leaves them really vulnerable in the way in which they'll pursue their careers. And certainly, the debates that we're having in this country, indeed internationally, around the appropriate uses and the risks of AI. Again, I've got lots of students who are learning those techniques, are devoted to exploring those domains. But we're being loud and clear. You can't think about a career in those fields without understanding the broader social, political implications of that expertise. So again, I think that it falls back to people in my position and the others in university leadership, deans, department chairs, to continually remind the students of the world that they're going out to, and that even when you get this narrow expertise, you've got to have some capacity to have perspective and judgment about the way in which that expertise is exercised.
Thank you. All right, we've got a little bit over a minute, so quickly, the last question that I think maybe we can leave with is somebody asked, what can all of us do, meaning not in our particular professional roles, but what can all of us do here to help improve civic education and the quality of civic life? In a minute and a half.
I would say help register people who support that to vote and get them out to vote. In America, it's all about politics.
I will say I'm on a local journalism kick these days. I know that many of us share a kind of feeling of that void in our lives. We happen to have a wonderful paper in New Orleans called the New Orleans Times-Picayune. It still has a full page of local news. I would say support your local newspaper, Valerie, am I right about that?
I love that.
Support your
Yes.
support your local newspaper.
Agreed.
Write them a bigger check than your subscription requires you to,
Oh, I
and
love
tell
that.
other people to
Yes.
subscribe.
I love that. And there's just for those, if any, who are here from Baltimore, you'll know there's a really interesting experiment underway in Baltimore right now where there's a new newspaper that's online, the Baltimore Banner, that is really focused on serious commitment to local news coverage, not doing traditional newsprint, not traditional distribution. And again, I think it's quite exciting in terms of the prospects that it creates for improved civil discourse understanding. And again, correcting the overweight that we see in cable news to a lot of performative positions that are taken at the national level.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for sharing your thoughts and expertise and care.